top barristers have written to Ofcom accusing the BBC of flouting impartiality by refusing to describe Hamas as terrorists. The group have urged the regulator to investigate the corporation and argue that the Beeb has taken sides by describing Hamas in more sympathetic terms. A number of government ministers have also criticised the state broadcaster. Watch this.
They're not freedom fighters, they're not militants. They are pure and simple terrorists. And it's remarkable this morning to go to the BBC website and still see them talking about gunmen and militants and not calling them terrorists.
Clearly it's a terrorist organisation. I'm very clear on that.
Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, I just want to make sure that you recognise that in your reporting. These are not militants, they are terrorists.
Well, James Cleverly not holding back there at the end, was he? But anyway, look, what do you think? OK, is it right to report the BBC to Ofcom for not calling Hamas terrorists? Let me know your thoughts. Email me or tweet me at GB News. And while you're there, go and vote in our poll. I'll bring you the results very, very shortly. But to debate this now, I am joined by former BBC chief political correspondent John Sargent and chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, Gary Mond. I will get to you first, John, and then I'll worm my way down the line, as it were. So is the BBC right to not call a terrorist organisation terrorists?
No, certainly are. People, of course, find it difficult to follow this. Lots of people do. They think, it's obvious the US government call them terrorists. We've heard all these people calling them terrorists. They don't seem to understand that the BBC's operation, the news operation, is not like a government. It's not meant to be a government. It's not meant to have a policy on the Middle East. This is, I don't know why people can't follow this, but if you're deeply involved in the struggle and you feel passionately about it, you can't understand. To you, it's common sense. Here are these people who are acting outrageously. They must be terrorists.
Slit a baby's throat.
Oh, sure it's not. No, that is an atrocity.
But that's a terrorist act.
No, it's a different matter. You are trying to... If you ask me what do I think about that, right? Straightforward question.
Yeah.
I left the BBC more than 20 years ago. What do I think about Hamas terrorism, right?
Right.
This is a terrorist act. That's quite straightforward. Ask me if I'm back in the BBC as a BBC correspondent, what the BBC should do. That is, of course, completely different. The BBC does not have an agenda. The BBC are not trying to decide who has done well or badly in the Middle East and then tell people what they should think.
The problem is, to some people, it makes them look, Gary,
sure,
like they do have an agenda.
Absolutely, sure it does.
That agenda is to support Hamas and Palestine.
I hear what John says, but with great respect, those are weasel words.
They're not weasel, no, they're not weasel words.
Let him
no, hold on a moment.
Okay,
they're not weasel words.
These
are well thought out, deliberate policy.
Think about it after you listen to him, so go on.
The King of England, Prince of Wales, the government, the opposition parties, they have all condemned Hamas as a terrorist organisation. And more than that, they're also a genocidal, murderous terrorist organisation. Their mission is to murder every Jew in the world. OK, they may not succeed in that, but they've made a jolly good start by killing more than 1,000 people in Israel.
OK.
It is completely unacceptable to do anything other than condemn them. You see, this is a struggle where it's just not possible to be neutral. In many, many conflicts and wars over the last 50 years, a lot of people have been neutral. This is one where, on the one side, you've got a group whose objective is literally to kill people in large numbers and to carry on killing them insofar as they're able to do. And on the other side, you've got innocent people who are trying to get on with their lives.
All right. John, the BBC does call other people terrorists.
Yeah, sure they do.
But what qualifies someone
How many more babies have got to be killed? Did you mean 1,000 babies, 2,000 babies?
OK, go on.
Just for a moment, look, of course, if you're involved, you don't expect, and I certainly don't expect people, there are Jewish friends of mine complaining bitterly about this. I quite understand that. I spent 30 years in the BBC. I was never told what to say, but I certainly knew what the rules were, and they go right back to the Second World War. What did the BBC staff say about the Nazis? Were they allowed to call them wicked or evil? No, they were not. They were told not to rant during the Second World War. So from then on, and the period I know, I went to Israel.
Would they not have called them far right, though? You know, would they not have said
They called them the enemy, but that was a different matter. You talk about enemy ships, enemy attacks, and so on. But what they were trying to do, now you may say, oh, why should they bother? Why not just, in fact, shout out whatever you think at any given moment, depending on how you feel? That's not how the BBC wanted to operate. When I was a young reporter, we weren't even allowed to... They used to take us off if we were even slightly running in the newsroom, because you're not meant to give any impression of panic. Okay. You're meant to keep calm and try and describe what's happening. Okay. Now, this, of course, allows people to say on the BBC all these points you've made can certainly be said on the BBC, and they are being said.
Right, there is one big difference between Nazi atrocities in the Second World War and what's happened today. The Nazi atrocities, particularly those committed in the early years of the war, were not that widely reported, were not that widely known. The fact that the Nazis were going into Eastern Europe in the days before there were gas chambers and actually doing exactly what Hamas have been doing in Israel this past few days wasn't often reported until much, much later.
That's nothing, that's quite beside the point.
In 1941, the BBC had known at that time what the Nazis were doing, I think they would have taken a different...
Look, in 1940, this is the point we're talking about, we nearly were finished off as a country.
There's nothing to do with it.
No, wait a minute. The Nazis were threatening to invade us. So the idea that, this wasn't... people weren't reporting, and of course they were reporting all these things. The key point to bear in mind is the BBC is not a government. It does not have a policy. It is trying to be impartial. And because of that, millions of people turn to the BBC. Millions of people.
The key point when it comes to these top barristers who've brought this
to the BBC
is that they say that the BBC's own editorial charter says that they should be calling Hamas terrorists. They're choosing not to.
No, what the lawyers and what these people are saying perfectly reasonably is that they are incensed by what Hamas are doing. Quite understandably, quite understand that. They just want that stopped. And if they could get the BBC to somehow come on their side and for it to be noticed, what would happen if the BBC said, you're quite right, let's change the policy? What do you think those headlines would be? The headlines would say, BBC swings towards Israel. BBC now backs Israel. I mean, the idea that you would suggest that, it's just a ridiculous point.
Let me just ask you a question in genuine good faith, Gary, which is, with respect, you are the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Are you a bit too close to this to look at it objectively?
I can tell you what the Jewish community are thinking.
Sure.
Prior to the events of a few days ago, the Jewish community were considerably concerned about bias shown over many years by the BBC. What has happened is there's been a quantum leap in that level of concern to contempt and condemnation of the BBC because of the BBC's failure to call this out as terrorism and, more than that, genocidal terrorism, which is what it actually is.
So it's the BBC's fault, not Hamas. Now, come along now.
It's the BBC's fault for not calling a spade a spade.
When you get a conflict of this sort, of course passions immediately rise. Look, I find some of this so upsetting, I don't even follow the developments. So you needn't tell me about how it's all it's just the Jewish community. We're all affected by this. These are very, very shocking events.
Final word, Gary, final word to you on this then.
My final word is I want to see the BBC change tack, and I want to see them call out this for genocidal terrorism, which is what it actually is.
Look, chaps, it's called The Clash. It's called The Clash. That's The Clash. And I do thank you both for coming on and putting up very much both sides of that argument. Good luck to both of you. Of course, that was... it's fun. Let me just see who you agree with. Here we go. So, as 4 top barristers accuse the BBC of taking sides, is it right to report the corporation to Ofcom or not for calling Hamas terrorists? Gus on Twitter says this. This is a publicly funded broadcaster which has become far too used to dictating its opinion rather than reporting. They should have been investigated years ago, and this recent performance justifies that perspective. Nick on Twitter says this. Anything that holds the media to account is good news to me. If Ofcom see fit to open an investigation to the BBC over this, that we should let them get on with it. Can I just clarify, at the point I came to air, Ofcom had very much not seen fit to form an investigation into this. In fact, they've basically said it's up to each individual broadcaster to take any editorial line that they want. For what it's worth, I certainly am not sitting here. I think it would be suicide if I did, by the way, to call for more Ofcom regulation on anything. But Pat on Twitter says, it's plain and simple. The BBC are not fit to broadcast anymore. Gosh. They don't even know what a terrorist is. All right, well, your verdict is now in, so I've been asking you to take part in this Twitter poll. 87% of you agree that it's right to report the BBC to Ofcom. for not calling Hamas terrorists. 13% of you say that is not. So those are the results.